Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, your source for all things digital transformation. So, Paresa, that was sort of a epic, very long interview with Wayne. I enjoy it, but what were your thoughts? What are some of your observations after hearing that segment?
Epic is a good word for it, I'd say. Wayne is he's a genius, I think. Just his perspectives and the way that he explains it almost brings it down to layman's terms, and it's easy to understand, so I can appreciate that on Wayne's part. So one thing he said that stood out to me is, it should be just common knowledge, right? But a lot of companies put technology at the center, right, rather than letting it play a supporting role. And that's something that Wayne was talking about a lot, is that technology should be playing a supporting role in any organization, not being the main focal point. And it's kind of like money. I mean, it amplifies who you are. If you bring on a new system and you don't have that foundation, you don't have that secure operating model, it's going to show when you go live. In your processes and just how it's received, how it's functioning. So it's interesting to hear how much of a foundational role the operating model plays. So just to sum it up, I mean, he mentioned it comes down to governance. It's your competitive driver. It helps you dial in on your performance metrics and figure out your processes and your workflows. Now, and maybe cybersecurity based on what we were talking about earlier, given the day and age, right? So, I mean, looking at how big of a role it plays, it sounds like if you don't have your operating model in place, set and secure and planned out before you go into an implementation, you could be setting yourself up for ERP failure. So, I mean, have you seen that in any of in any cases that you've worked on, or have any examples of what exactly the impact is if you don't have a secure and stable operating model before you go into a digital transformation?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to try to simplify it, to start on that thread, as far as what happens when you don't have that business process model or operating model in place. It's a lot like building a house. I mean, if you think about if you were going to have a new house built, the question would be, would you just start bringing in your roofers and your drywall guys and your electricians and the plumbers and all that stuff without having a clearly defined set of parameters for what you want the house to look like? And that's really the question that you have to ask. And a lot of times what happens is organizations fall victim or prey to this concept that's perpetuated by software vendors and system integrators, that you don't need to worry about the operating model. Our software will do the opposite of what you said, Parisa, which is our software is going to define for you what your operating model is. And that's just absolutely not true. Part of the reason it's not true is because, first of all, you're operating down at a transactional level. When you're dealing with software, you're down in the weeds by definition. You're defining how you're going to have different transactions flow and what buttons you push and what the screens look like and all that stuff. And if you do that absent of that overarching blueprint, if you will, or business process or operating model blueprint, you're just shooting in the dark. I mean, yeah, you might have a bunch of really good pieces put together here with your software vendor system integrator, but how it ties together with end-to-end processes like Wayne talked about, that's a whole different story. And so what ends up happening if you don't do that, then it's a lot like how you would predict a house building would go if you didn't have a clear blueprint for all of your contractors and various people involved in the building of the house. You need to have that blueprint. And if you don't, what ends up happening in a transformation is just a lot of things. You get misalignment. You're not on the same page with what it is you're trying to accomplish because you haven't defined as a team what you want to be when you grow up. So either you end up arguing, or there's misalignment or tension with the team, and or your system integrator will just take care of it for you and they'll define for you what you want to look like. And that is definitely not the right answer. So neither one of those are the right answer. So that's one symptom. Another symptom is you can't really focus on change management because you don't have a clear operating model defined. So you change management team ends up waiting until the software is built before they can really start any meaningful change management. So that's another I'd say a symptom of that problem. And then, project governance. It becomes very difficult to decide, do we want to customize the software? Do we want to configure it this way or that way? Decision making becomes super difficult because you have no you have no blueprint, you have no vision. And so your system integrator starts asking you questions of how you want the software to work and what your needs are. And you're probably, without having that clear blueprint, you're probably going to revert back to what you've always done because that's what you know and you haven't defined anything otherwise. And so, what I'd say is if you're really aiming for process improvements and you're really trying to change your business, then I would say that operating model concept is really critical. Now, if you happen to be one of those few companies where, hey, our processes are great, we don't really need to improve them, we just need to upgrade our technology, then okay, maybe it's not quite as important. You still want to do it, but it might not be quite as valuable. But I'd still suggest for any organization, even if you're doing a relatively simple, and I use the word relatively pretty strongly because no upgrade is simple, then you still want to have that operating model to some degree.
Right. Interesting. I mean, from those symptoms that you're sharing, it sounds like those are pieces that will elongate a transformation project, which in the past we've talked about that costs you more money. The longer an implementation takes, the more money you're forking out to your vendors, to everybody that's involved. So, I mean, and just as far as timelines, if you plan ahead and you spend a lot of time pouring into your operating model, you're going to probably save money because you're saving time. It's almost like a domino effect. If you don't get the first chain of the like the link of the chain right, then it's going to affect the whole project. It's interesting.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. I'm glad you said that because I failed to mention that super important point in my response, which is, that is another symptom is going over budget, taking longer than expected. And just to build even further, you probably recall there was a segment, I think there's a couple questions about Agile. We were talking about Agile a couple times throughout the conversation. And Agile, this whole concept of Agile runs counter to this operating model concept, because Agile oftentimes, and I'm generalizing, and I know I'll have Agile purists out there that are going to crucify me for saying some of this stuff. But in general, what you often see is that people will use Agile as an excuse to not do that upfront work. They just jump in and start building stuff. They try to get the minimum viable product. They try to put something in front of the users, get their response or get their feedback, and then go tweak it. And they're doing it in the name of speed. And I think in many ways, Agile is an overreaction to the fact that transformations have been so cumbersome and difficult in the past. So Agile is sort of a perceived way to speed things up. But to your point, if you do Agile or any other sort of fast implementation without taking that time up front to define your processes and your operating model, it's going to actually take you longer to get it right later on. You might get started faster, and it might look like you might feel like it looks like you're moving faster on paper, but long term, that's typically going to take you longer because you're operating without a plan. So I think you can use, if you have that operating model clearly defined up front, then you can start to use Agile and how you deploy the technological solutions and the roll out the process improvements that you've defined and all that good stuff. But I don't think you want to start out of the gates with skipping or bypassing that more waterfall-ish approach to defining your operating model clearly up front. So long-winded way of saying I totally agree with you. Time, cost, resources are optimized when you have a clear operating model.
Right. That makes total sense. And the other thing that Wayne was talking about, or that both of you guys were talking about, is that having a set operating model can act as your differentiator in the market and drive your competitive advantage. I mean, especially if you're a larger organization, if you can perform more efficiently than your competitor, then chances are it's going to trickle down to your customer experience as well. So I guess before I dive into the whole concept of operational excellence, which I want to chat about briefly, I'm curious, if a company dials in on their operating model, can they change it, or is that like their core, kind of like their core values? Is that something that stays consistent over the years, even as the world changes, like almost like their mission statement or something, or can they change it as time goes on?
Yeah, it's a great question. And operating models generally are sort of a living, or they should be a living, breathing type of thing. It really reflects a snapshot or a moment in time where you are operationally or where you want to be operationally, at that moment in time. Now, over time, what ends up happening is your operating model, if that remains static, the reality is your processes are going to change and evolve over time. The question is, are you going to clearly define how those processes are going to change, or are people just organically going to tweak things and start messing with that operating model and letting it go, a million different directions? And that's usually what happens. Companies just sort of define the operating model and then they forget about it. And then what ends up happening, if you look out like 10, 15, 20 years, what ends up happening is if you don't have that clear operating model, then you're probably letting processes drift whatever direction people want to take them. And when I say people, I mean all of your employees. And then the technology is going to drift too, because technology is constantly changing. And if you're, especially if you're using a cloud solution, it's going to constantly upgrade and update. And that ends up drifting. And what ends up happening is 10, 15 years later, you have this divergence between where your processes actually are today and where the technology is, and your operating model that you intended is probably somewhere in the middle, and you're just completely misaligned. And then you freak out and say, I need a new ERP system, or I need new technology because they're broken. And what you find is, well, actually, it's not necessarily even broken. It's just that you let it, sort of drift apart from what you wanted. And so, I think the key there is to have that process governance and the operating model governance in place, in that mentality of continuous improvement, to where you're consciously tweaking and making deliberate decisions around what you want your processes to look like, rather than just letting it evolve however it's going to evolve. So to answer your question, it should be a living, breathing document. But what ends up happening is people sort of, even if they do what Wayne is suggesting in the discussion there, and you clearly define that operating model, it's not like one and done. You do it once and then you do it the next time you roll out technology in 10 or 20 years. You want to constantly update that along the way.
Yeah, that makes sense. I imagine a lot of operating models changed in 2020.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, you think about restaurants and retailers, and just at a micro level or a local community level, think of all the businesses you interact with and how much they've had to change, or your doctor, your dentist, all they've all had to change in some pretty significant way. And a lot of times that involves technology, or they're trying to figure out how technology could help them enable that business model. But even things behind the scenes that a lot of people don't see, or consumers don't see day to day, like B2B providers that are selling industrial products to another manufacturer or whatever. Even those businesses have changed, because not only are they dealing with remote workforces in some cases, or some of the challenges that every organization is facing, but then you have the supply chain disruptions that are being perpetuated or fueled by COVID in this post-COVID world. You also have now this expectation in the market that we can do more things digitally or electronically, and so even B2B providers are trying to find ways to use e-commerce or retail type of mentalities to provide better service to their customers. So I think everyone, or most organizations in some way, have been directly or indirectly impacted, in 2020 and
Absolutely.
beyond.
Absolutely. It just goes to show how important it is to be flexible, as the world continues to change. I mean, talking about competitive advantage and using your operating model as a differentiator, it trickles into the conversation about operational excellence, which I know Dave Beldick just recently he spoke on it in at Digital Stratosphere, and he just recently wrote a piece about it. So diving into that, I mean, operational excellence to me, it's when your operations are working seamlessly. Every department, every technology, all your processes are working synergistically. I guess the concept goes hand in hand in laying the groundwork for your operating model. So I guess one thing that I'm curious about is, this is about business process management and business process mapping, for example. It's looking at your current state, where are you now, and that helps you develop your operating model, right? So if that's the case, say you're about to go on a digital transformation. I know something that we talk about a lot is you need to think of the future state of your business when you're going into a transformation. Where do you want to be 5, 10, 20 years from now? Whereas this conversation is look at where you are today. What are your processes today? What is your governance today? And understand where you are before you implement a new technology. So I guess, can you help bridge the gap? Which is it? Is it, should we be looking at the future state, or should we be looking at where we are today? How do they relate to each other?
Yeah, that's a great observation and nuance that you're pointing out here. Is that, yeah, I'd say what it's not. You don't necessarily want to just define an operating model that solidifies or documents or codifies what you're doing today. Generally, you're looking to the future in some capacity. Now, the question is, are we looking 10 years out? Are we looking at what we think we want to be today or in the next 3 to 5 years? that's a tough question to answer. But in general, I'd say most organizations we work with sort of know that the current state isn't working. That's why they've hired us, and that's why they typically want to go through some sort of transformation. So they know that much. They know the current state's not working. We know we're not just going to create an operating model to replicate it today. But the question is, are we looking 10 years out, or are we looking 3 years out, or 1 year out, or whatever the case may be? I would say that the further out you look, the more deliberate you have to be about how you're going to get there. So we could define an operating model for 5 to 10 years out, or what we think is going to work 5 to 10 years out, even though chances are fairly high that's going to need to be modified as things change over time. But let's just say you define that. Then we need to back into, okay, how are we going to get there? Because we're not just going to put in new technology and overnight we've gotten there. It's obviously a longer journey. So it's a matter of using that desired future state as a way to define what your overall strategy and roadmap is. And for a lot of organizations, especially larger multinational organizations, these transformations, these journeys can take several years. We have one client, for example, that's the largest steel producer in North America, and they're, I think, on year 4 or 4.5 of a 7-year transformation. And a lot of organizations just are baffled by that. They can't imagine a 7-year project. And, most organizations, to be fair, shouldn't take 7 years, but this is a massive company with a lot of different locations, and they're pretty complex business. So, in that state, you kind of want to know that we're going to define our operating model, then we have to back into where we are today and then figure out the roadmap to get there. And then, by the way, along the way, in years 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or however long it takes, things are going to change, and your operating model is probably going to need to be modified as well. So it's definitely, there's a lot of art to that. There's science to the operating model part of it, but the art of figuring out how do we get there, and what are the different steps, and what's that strategy, therein lies the art. And a lot of that comes down to, your culture, your risk tolerance, and your ability to change. There's a lot of things that factor into that we assess to help clients figure that out.
Interesting. And I mean, talking about timelines, you mentioned in your conversation with Wayne, I think it was a client that you had that was able to execute their transformation in 12 months, so in 1 year, which sounds like that's kind of quick. And when they were asked, how did you do it? They said they spent over half the time in the planning phase. So 60% of the whole project was planning, laying down the groundwork for this operating model, for their processes, etc. So I guess, what is the average transformation time? I mean, it obviously depends on the size of the company and number of employees and blah, blah, blah. But what would you say at a high level for this particular company that you were talking about, for example, what's the average timeline?
Yeah, so that's another, maybe I'll throw in a caveat here before I answer that. There's sort of what is the actual average, and then what should the average be, and those aren't necessarily the same thing. When you look at research we've done over the years, for over 10 years now, we've been doing annual surveys and studies of actual implementation results for organizations throughout the world. Not just our clients. We're actually intentionally looking outside of our client base to get a better feel for, what's the market doing in general. And when we've studied that metric as far as how long a project takes, the average has hovered between 16 and 18 months. But that's an average for companies of all sizes, all different industries, geographies, et cetera. So you have to normalize it for who you are. For example, we have some clients that have implemented in 3 to 6 months. We have other clients that, like I mentioned, that have taken 6 to 7 years. So there's a huge variation there, but the average, the unweighted average in the market tends to fall between 16 and 18 months.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. There's a lot that goes into it, from the planning side to making sure your team receives the new change correctly. There's a lot that goes into it. And I know that, the conversation of how long it takes to implement an ERP system or any system, it like you said, it ranges. And I'm excited to kind of run through the conversation you had with a handful of people on LinkedIn about, is it possible to do a transformation in 6 weeks?
Yeah, I'm highly skeptical of that concept. There's software vendors out there, especially when you're looking at the smaller organization. So a company that is on QuickBooks now, or some basic accounting software, and they're sort of going to their first ERP system, or just something more robust than what they have. Those organizations, can certainly implement faster than, say, the big steel companies, that examples that I mentioned. But 6 weeks is pretty aggressive when you think about all the things that need to happen, as far as process changes and just getting your people to change. Even if you could have the system fully designed and the processes perfectly designed and ready to go on day one, it's probably going to take you more than 6 weeks just to get your people to figure out, how to use it and get them on board with it, and fine tune it and just get it operational. But then obviously you add in the fact that you have to define your processes, you have to design and build the software, test it, all that stuff. It usually takes a lot longer. And there's companies out there like Oracle NetSuite, I think, is guilty of this, and a lot of other vendors are, that especially the ones that target the small companies. Oracle, for example, will come out and say, hey, we've got Suite Success. It's a sort of a methodology and a framework they use to fast track an implementation. And we see it a lot with our smaller clients where they say, hey, within 90 days, you'll be up and running with our entire suite of products. And the problem is that technically they're right. You could flip a switch and you could probably have it up faster than 90 days. You could probably spend a weekend or maybe just a few days, getting it up and running. The problem is there's just so many decisions you have to make about how you want to configure it, what you want your process flow to look like, how are you going to move the data over, how are you going to test it, make sure it works with your business, how are you going to get your people adapted. You add up all that stuff and suddenly you're looking at a lot more than 6 weeks or 90 days or whatever. I don't want to say it can't be done, but it's highly unusual to have an implementation that takes less than 90 days. And for the ones that do, oftentimes it's sort of like a good news, bad news situation. Like, good news, congratulations, you implemented in less than 90 days. But the bad news is now your operations are a mess and you can't ship product and you've got consequences to deal with on the other side of go live. So you have to straddle that too. You have to figure out, how much is this really going to take us and how much is it really going to cost us, not just in the initial 6 weeks, 90 days or whatever, 18 months, 6 years, whatever the duration is. You also have to look at what are we doing to our operations and what's that ROI after the fact. And sometimes you find that, you'll end up with a negative ROI simply based on the fact that you lost a bunch of customer orders or customers are irritated and ticked off at you because you can't ship product. How much does that cost? You have to look at that as well.
Yeah, opportunity costs for sure. That's interesting. Do you want me to dive into your LinkedIn posts right now? Should we cut to a quick break?
Sure. Yeah, let's go to a break, and then we'll be right back in this last segment. You can dig into the post, and we'll take some more audience or social media type engagement. So we'll take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Okay, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. I'm here with Paresa Noble, and we were just talking about operating models, which we've been talking about for a while now, and this whole segment or this whole episode is largely devoted to operating models, business process improvement, all that good stuff. And before the break, you were starting to dive into some social media engagement and conversations that were happening related to this topic of operating models, but also we were starting to get into implementation durations as well. How long does it take? Should it take? All that good stuff. So what do you see in there on social media?
That's right. Well, I mean, we touched on the concept of, is it possible to do this in 6 weeks? And you posed that question to people on LinkedIn as well. And it was interesting to see the responses. So just to position the question that you asked, here's the scenario. You have a software vendor who we'll call ABC. They tell the prospect that they can implement their solution in 6 weeks for $150,000 USD. Can it be done? Is it possible? What's your opinion? And we had a handful of different responses. So I wanted to run through a few that stood out to me. One was from Tanya Franklin, and she's saying it's possible. I think she was one of the only ones that went against the grain and said it might be possible. So good for you, Tanya. I think that, her position is it depends on the type of system. You can't do a full on ERP implementation. It must be a project with a smaller scope. That was her, kind of end line with it. But her thought is if you have strong resources from, your partners, your vendor, your executive leadership, if you have a carefully developed project plan and, an operating model like we were just talking about, it can be done. So that's one perspective of it. Another is, it depends on the industry and the product because certain products will need more customization. And let's see, it can be deployed with standard packs within 2 to 3 weeks, depending on, what product. That's Ali Arsalan said that. And then we had Ashfaq say, not possible if you're going for ideal results. He just started with Oracle Financials Cloud, and it's an ocean. I love that metaphor. I imagine it's an ocean. There's so much to do there just on the system side. And then, like you were saying, Eric, you add in kind of the data migration, the organizational change management component. There's so much that goes into it. So we had some mixed reviews, and it's interesting to see, you either choose, do you want it to be done right or do you want it to be done quickly, is what it seems like.
Yeah, and most executives, I think, would probably say both. We want it done right, and we want it done quickly. But you do
right.
have to decide. It's sort of like the in project management. One of the schools of thought in project management is that you have speed, cost, and quality, and you can only have two of those three. You can't have all three of those. You can't go fast, high quality, and low cost. You can only have two of the three. So it's sort of the same thing here. You have to prioritize and figure out what's more important. If you're a high growth company that is moving quickly, then maybe speed is more important. So once you prioritize and you figure out what those priorities are and what your most important factors are, then you have a more realistic view of what that's going to look like.
Interesting. Well, I thought we could finish this episode off with a fun game that kind of ties into this. So I'm gonna describe a company type, and I want to name off different like best of breed systems, like a CRM, SCM, etc. And then you tell us what is the timeline or average timeline that people should be shooting for. Okay. So for this game, let's think of a company that is in high growth. They're in high growth phase. They're growing super fast. It's a fulfillment company that is shipping products to customers worldwide. So they have a warehouse. They also help manufacture products. So they have supply chain situation. They, sell to B2B businesses. So they need help with sales too. So it's kind of a full scope company that could really utilize any of these systems. So are you ready, Eric?
I'm ready. I didn't know this was a game, but it feels like a lot of pressure. Is there money at stake? Could I win or lose money based on my responses here?
I think you're good. We'll keep the money out of it. Keep it
Okay.
safe. Maybe next time.
Okay.
Okay, so if this company wanted to implement a CRM, how long on average would it and should it take?
Okay, so before, and those that know me know that I overthink things and I'm very analytical. So before I answer, I have to give a disclaimer that do not quote me on this. And if you're listening and you fit that exact profile that Paresa just described and you're ready to write down my answer and that's going to be the duration you're banking your career on, do not do that. That's a terrible idea. But I'll give you an answer based on limited information. So assuming they've selected a CRM system, and let's just say they pick Salesforce or whatever it is, and they already know what the CRM is. And do we know how many employees they have? Did you say that? Or
Let's say they have 100 employees.
Okay, so maybe they have, let's just say they have like 20 salespeople, 15, 20 salespeople-ish. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, sure. That sounds good.
Then I would say this probably is a case where you could deploy in less than 90 days if you knew the software, if you had, especially if you already have a clear vision of what you want your sales processes and your customer service processes to look like. I would say absolutely you could do that in 90 days. If you don't have your processes defined, and if you're very disparate right now, and this is going to be a massive change for you, as an organization, I'd say it's probably going to take you more than 90 days. And the other assumption I'm drawing here, maybe just assuming, is that there are, as a high growth company, you typically have limited resources internally. So your people are probably going to get distracted with day to day stuff while you're trying to roll out this new CRM system. So that's going to slow you down. Again, I'm not talking about just technically, can you turn on the system in X amount of time? I'm talking about how long till you're actually using it. So I'd say all those things probably push you to, I'd say 5 to 6 months, on average. But the exception being if you had those other caveats in place, like you had a clear vision of what you want, and this isn't a huge change for your organization, you could probably do it in less than 3 months.
Interesting. See, process planning, it just makes all the difference, it sounds like. Okay,
Yep.
how about a supply chain management system?
Supply chain management. So that's more complicated because you're touching more processes and you're inherently having to touch things outside of supply chain. So now you're touching your customer orders, your sales team, your financials. Everything sort of ties back to that supply chain management. So I'm going to assume that you're talking about implementing a supply chain management system that also needs to integrate to your financials, maybe to your CRM, your inventory management, whatever the case may be. I'd say in this case, I would say probably if you weren't doing the CRM project at the same time, so let's assume that this is a standalone, we're just doing supply chain management right now. I would say at least 6 to 9 months.
Interesting.
Yeah,
That
probably,
makes sense.
probably more. But you run it right. You have a solid strategy. You have the technology picked. You have the plan up front to do the operating model and to get a solid plan and governance in place. I'd say you could probably do it in 6 to 9 months for that size of organization. If you're a larger organization with multinational and multiple warehouses, multiple locations, that number could go up to a couple years if it's a larger organization or a larger supply chain.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, supply chain is way more complex than a sales process, I would imagine. So that
Yeah.
makes sense. What about a warehouse management software?
So warehouse management, it's a little bit more isolated, I guess, in some ways. You're dealing with inventory management, which spans, the supply chain and other parts of the business as well. But it's largely confined to, pick, packing, shipping within a warehouse. So you're sort of, isolating the change, isolating the impact, relatively speaking. Obviously, if you mess up your inventory or your warehouse can't ship, obviously that affects a lot of people and can have a lot of negative implications. But in general, it's a little bit more isolated. So I'd say longer than it would take to implement CRM, but not as long as it would take to implement supply chain management. So I'd put it at somewhere around, let's say 5 to 6 months.
Okay, got it. Okay, let's look at the HR side of things. How about a human capital management system?
Yeah, those actually I think are the hardest to predict because on one hand you think it's just HCM, it's just HR. We only have say five. In this example, maybe they have 5 HR people or whatever the number might be. With 100 employees, I can't imagine they have more than 5 or 10 HR people, probably less. So you think, okay, that's not that many people, so it's not going to be that hard to change. Well, you're actually impacting all of your employees. That's the one technology where everyone's going to be impacted because now you're talking about performance management, performance reviews, hiring and firing, recruiting, all that stuff. The whole hire to retire process is affected by human capital management and HR systems. So you're affecting everyone, which amplifies or bumps up the duration and the effort it takes. I'd say it's probably, even for this size of an organization, it's if you want to do it right and you don't want to have a ton of disruption with your HR processes, which you could do. I mean, if you are going to pick an area where you're okay with the disruption, I suppose HR might be an okay one to pick. I wouldn't recommend it, but if you had to pick one, just because, most organizations can deal with someone not being able to fill out their benefits paperwork in the way they want them to, but they can deal with that a lot easier than they can deal with not being able to ship product or not being able to close the books or run a report of what their P&L is or whatever. So I'd say, you can probably take a little more risk with HR systems, and I apologize to HR professionals out there who totally disagree with me, and I'm sure some of you do. But, that realistically speaking, that's what we found. So I'd say you might be able to do it in more like the CRM range, like a 3 to 6 month window. I'd suggest more like 6 months if you want to minimize disruption, but if you wanted to take a risk and say, hey, we'll take our chances just in the name of getting something up and running faster, you could probably do it closer to 3.
Okay. Interesting. All right. What if they wanted to do a full-on digital facelift and get an ERP system to just run everything for them from their supply chain all the way to accounting, invoicing, etc.?
So I'd put them pretty close to that average across the board that we talked about before, that 16 to 18 months. Maybe a little bit lower, assuming they do things right. And that's the other thing you have to be careful of with benchmarks, is even though I have this benchmark that I share, which is 16 to 18 months as the average, that's the average of what actually happens, not what should happen or what could happen if you do things right. So if you really look at, leveraging implementation best practices and leading with the business, not the technology, investing in change management, all the stuff that we talk about in this podcast and YouTube videos and all the stuff we put out there and all the advice we typically give to our clients, if you do all those things, you could probably do it in closer to a year. But you have to do those things right. If you don't do those things right, it's probably going to take more like 16 to 18 months, maybe longer if you really screw things up. So a lot of it depends on how you plan and how you execute.
Right. Yep. It just goes back to summarize, excuse me, everything we talked about is laying the foundation brick by brick, planning it out, mapping it out, and that's what's going to help you transform your business in way less time than you would if you didn't. So makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the key to your questions there, the key way to think about for people listening of what about my business? My business is X number of employees, X number of locations and countries and all that stuff. Hopefully that way of thinking, me trying to think out loud, will demonstrates how you should think about how you're going to define your timeline. And keep in mind too, you're going to get a proposal from your software vendor or vendors that are probably overly optimistic and incomplete. So you need to translate what they give you into reality. And I've kind of verbalized how you translate some of that into reality based on how you run the project and some of the different assumptions that go into these sorts of transformations.
Right. Fascinating stuff, I gotta say.
Yeah. So thanks for that speed round. I'm glad I didn't lose money on that because I hate gambling. So unless I win, then of course I love it. But generally I don't gamble. So that was fun. So thanks for another good episode, Paresa. Good to have you back, and we'll look forward to our next episode next week.
Sounds great. Thanks, Eric. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks everyone for listening. And you're listening to Transformation Ground Control. Be sure to subscribe, share this video, or share this recording or the audio format with friends and colleagues. We'd love to get the word out, and certainly drop us a review too. Give us a thumbs up and/or a review on the podcast platform that you're listening or watching this on. And in the meantime, we will see you all next week. Have a good day.